Ma'am, you can start now.
Namaskar and a very good morning, all of you. On behalf of INYAS, myself, Dr. Upasana Ray, and my INYAS colleague, Dr. Nishan Chakravarti, along with our GYANTEEKA team, welcome you all to today's session of GYANTEEKA. GYANTEEKA is a platform to disseminate facts and awareness about vaccines, and currently we are particularly focusing on COVID-19, a pandemic that we all are dealing with since 2020 March. For any nation, generally speaking, national priority follows an order of national security first, followed by economy and development, and then health. In recent times, however, health issues, particularly arising out of infectious diseases, have invited considerable levels of national and as well as international attention. COVID-19 is such an example that we are already dealing with that has such international cooperation and collaborations. Today, we will discuss about science diplomacy, a new type of diplomacy that emphasizes connectivity between science, technology, and international affairs to tackle national and global challenges. Science diplomacy helps in developing constructive international partnerships. It involves utilization of scientific collaborations among nations to address common problems through diplomatic dialogues and course of action. During the COVID-19 pandemic days, we have come across the term vaccine diplomacy as well. India has entered into many diplomatic dialogues with her neighbors, Southeast Asian and other nations in favor of vaccine accessibility of needy countries and much more. We have been hearing about vaccine Maitri, policies like Neighborhood First and Act East, etc. We will learn more about science diplomacy in context of COVID-19 and vaccine from today's speaker. Today, our speaker is Dr. Bhaskar Balakrishnan, adjunct faculty member at GSS University, Mysore. Dr. Bhaskar Balakrishnan has been an Indian diplomat for over 30 years and served as an ambassador of India to Greece and Cuba. He has worked in several countries, Europe, Middle East, Africa, and for many years with various UN organizations in Geneva and Vienna. He has set up and headed the Investment and Technology Promotion Division of Ministry of External Affairs concerned with promotion of foreign investment and technology flows. We are delighted to have you here on GYANTEEKA team with us. So without taking more time, now I invite Dr. Balakrishnan to deliver his talk. So Zoom is all yours now.
Thank you very much, Dr. Upasana, and thank you, Dr. Nishant, for this opportunity. And a very good morning to all the participants at this forum. It's a real pleasure to interact with you all. Now let me go to share my presentation so that, okay. So I hope it's visible now. Just confirm.
Yes, sir.
Let me start with the first slide. Okay. So the topic is science diplomacy and COVID-19 vaccine diplomacy of India. Now, Dr. Upasana has already mentioned something about science diplomacy. So it has made my job easier. I will only give a brief introduction. Actually, there's a lot to talk about in science diplomacy. And it can be the subject of a whole discussion in itself. And so COVID-19 and vaccine diplomacy, again, are very important and big subjects. So we can just about touch the surface of these topics in a short lecture today. So what is science diplomacy? Well, it's been around for a long time, but nobody actually called it science diplomacy. Every time countries work together on science and technology collaboration, it's a form of science diplomacy. But it was, unlike other kinds of diplomacy, in the political diplomacy, economic diplomacy, cultural diplomacy, science diplomacy was not actually known as such for a long time. But it started in 2010 with the American Academy of Sciences and the Royal Society coining a new term called science diplomacy. And this was the first paper in which which is 2010, in which they went into the whole conceptual foundation of science diplomacy. Now, apart from that, other conceptual foundation of science technology, science diplomacy were also found in a paper in 2017 by Peter Gluckman, which basically says that you can divide it into national, transborder, and global levels, dividing it according to the field of action. In the Royal Society, it was basically three pillars were coined. One was science in diplomacy, science for diplomacy, and diplomacy for science, which became really the best known conceptual basis for science diplomacy across the world. Now, both of these approaches emanated from the West, developed countries. There was hardly any emphasis given on the importance of strengthening the national science technology capacity through science diplomacy. So when we started our project at RIS in 2018, we wanted to rebalance the whole idea of science diplomacy and bring in the concept that two basic things which are very important. One is that using science diplomacy to strengthen the national science, technology, and innovation capacity. And secondly, targeting the diaspora science and technology workers who are spread across the world and engaging with them to strengthen our national ecosystem. So these two things are very important for India and most other developing countries too. So we are trying to bring that aspect into it. For us, in seeing it from the developing world, a broad definition of science diplomacy would be the full integration of science, technology, and innovation into foreign policy and diplomacy. So that's our working definition, which covers everything which we are interested in. Now, let me go into some more details about this. The first pillar of science diplomacy conventionally was giving advice to policymakers, including foreign policy, the scientific input into foreign policy making. For example, in nuclear issues, climate change issues, cybersecurity, the scientific advice is very important in order to frame our diplomatic posture. Second pillar is to use science and scientific capacity with diplomacy while negotiating on global issues. For example, if there are control regimes like MTCR, NSG, or if there are new treaties coming up which regulate certain new areas like cybersecurity, then the scientific capacity is very important so that our negotiators can achieve the best results. The other aspect is how do you use science, technology, and innovation capacity to strengthen relations with countries and between countries. So that is science for diplomacy. Examples were the US used it with the Soviet Union during the Cold War, with Cuba, North Korea, scientific relations are going on. In our context, we can think of science diplomacy with, for example, Pakistan, with whom we have difficult relations in the political sector. But scientists from both countries can talk to each other on issues of common concern like health or environmental pollution or things like that. The next aspect is how do you use diplomatic capacity, your diplomatic machinery, to engage with other countries to strengthen your own ecosystem in science and technology? And how do you also participate in large-scale mega projects like the CERN, Large Hadron Collider, the ITER, the Square Kilometer Array, 30-meter telescope? There are a lot of new large mega projects coming up because it is no longer affordable for individual countries to do these projects. So there's a growing number of cases where large projects are being undertaken by groups of countries. So, and this is a very effective and economical way of engaging in frontier science research. And our scientists, of course, should take full advantage of this. So how do you enable our science and technology system to engage in these mega science projects? How do we negotiate a place at the table where we get to participate fully and effectively in these large projects for our benefit? So that's another important thing, that diplomacy for science. And the last aspect, which is especially important for countries like us, because we have a lot of Indian scientists and technologists working in advanced countries, achieving very good results. So we want to use our diplomacy and to engage with them so that they can connect with our own scientific establishment and work together and thereby strengthen our own science and technology capacity. It's not that we want them to come back physically and settle down in India. We know that's not realistic for many people. But where they are working, if we can engage with them there with some institution from India, then our institution can benefit from such collaboration. And we have found that most of our uh, diaspora, NRI, PIO, scientists and technologists are very happy and very willing to help us, help Indian institutions in their respective fields. So now we come to vaccine diplomacy. It's a subset of science diplomacy or subset of also health diplomacy. It's a form of health diplomacy. There are many countries who use their strengths in the health system for diplomatic purposes. Cuba is one good example, but we won't have time to go into that. It's a form of health diplomacy. It involves the use of vaccines to improve a country's relationship with others and its global influence. Also, use of diplomacy to get access to the best practices in vaccine technology and development. Then enhance bilateral and multilateral cooperation for joint R&D on vaccines. Facilitate early access to vaccines. And this was first found practiced during the global effort against smallpox. Now, health diplomacy, for example, a small country like Cuba has a tremendous medical education capacity. They have a huge extra number of seats in their medical colleges. So they are offering medical scholarships to people from other countries. So that's a form of using their health diplomacy. They also have a system of medical brigades, self-contained medical units, which they can send out whenever there's a health crisis. For example, an Ebola outbreak, they send them to West Africa. In Italy, when the COVID broke out, they sent a team there. In Pakistan, when there was an earthquake in northern Pakistan, they sent a medical brigade there. So they have this capacity of rapid intervention in health crises. So that's their form of health diplomacy. They use it to leverage their international role in that. Now, what are the circumstances under which vaccine diplomacy can sort of take root? First is when there is a limited availability of vaccines globally. Then second factor is that when it is urgently required to administer vaccines, especially during the growth phase of a pandemic, when you want to control its growth, and even later when you want to put out the fire. Then existence of a large capacity to manufacture the vaccine. Of course, the vaccines have to be approved by regulators nationally and globally. Then how do you coordinate the rollout of the domestic vaccine requirement and the export? So you have to see how to balance your own requirement of vaccinating your own population with the external demand for the vaccines. And the export of the vaccines can be on grant basis, free, that is as aid, or on a commercial basis to be paid for as at price. Then the next aspect is your vaccines need to get approval from national regulatory authorities, NRAs, and international agencies, so that these vaccines can be used in the countries which are interested in. And then, of course, it's also important for future market access of the vaccine, because we are looking at a product which could be exported for a long time. Expectations of future market opportunities for vaccines. So one of the motivations of vaccine diplomacy is to open up markets for future vaccine exports to various countries. Now, if we look at what happened in the last 2 years, exactly 2 years, now COVID-19, as you know, spread from China in November 2019 to across the world. We are still trying to figure out what was the origin of this epidemic, this pandemic, how the virus actually came into the world in the first place. Was it a result of an accident at a research laboratory, or was it a natural emergence of the virus? Or these questions are still to be settled, and I'm sure that a lot more work will go into this. At present, now we have 226 million cases all across the world and 4.9 million deaths, which is a pretty high number, considering that it's comparable and probably exceeding the 1918 Great Flu Pandemic. In India alone, there were 34 so far, 34 million cases and 453,000 deaths. This is also quite big. The responses by countries were very uneven. There was no standardized response or agreed. Everybody did his own thing. Some had no restrictions and some had extreme lockdowns, which we practiced in March 2020. And restrictions, they had other side effects on the economy. And there were delays in adopting control measures. You see, we lost about 2 months since the first case came up in China in November. And it took almost 2 months before WHO declared this as a pandemic and control measures came into place. In those 2 months, the damage was done. Firstly, by not promptly declaring and reporting what happened in November 2019. In fact, some of the doctors who wanted to report this, they were taken to task by the authorities. And secondly, not allowing the prompt arrival of the inspection team from WHO, delaying it. And then, of course, finally, in the WHO had only 2 options. Either there is control or no control. There was no graded response saying that there is like a yellow light. So either red or green. So that was also a problem because WHO group, the concerned group, hesitated before declaring it a red light and putting all controls because they said they wanted more evidence. Now, if we had yellow and orange and green and red light system, then we could have had a better way of handling the situation, which is what the DG of WHO has now proposed. So this pandemic led to extreme pressures and stresses on the health system. We all know that. We have seen them on TV, overload on hospitals, clinics, even the funeral services. Elderly, vulnerable groups were particularly affected. There were post-recovery health problems, which put a burden on the health system. There was need for ICU treatment for a long time, shortages of critical equipment, ventilators and medical oxygen particularly. Then even PPE kits and sanitation products and equipment were needed because the control system. Our health workers came under extreme pressure, and one must give a high tribute to their dedication and hard work. Because in the face of so much of problems all across the world, they really worked hard to save the rest of the society. And there were many unknown factors in how the disease progresses and what is the sequel. And of course, because of that, there was a certain amount of misinformation about the disease. So these were all the stresses which came. Now, the international level cooperation, despite the slow start, WHO speeded up the action after February 2020. There were the adverse effect of the US-China tensions. The Chinese were seen as not cooperating fully in the early phase. And even some people said that they have trying to take advantage of the outbreak. There were uncoordinated responses in Europe, even though the European Union is there, but health is not a sector where the European Union has competence. It's up to each country. Failure to agree on national vaccination certificate, even now, has impeded travel, normalization of travel and the travel industry. So here I must say that there's a lot of disappointment that the Covaxin is not yet got the approval, emergency use authorization from WHO. There are 2 basic things. One is when you give authorization to administer the vaccine, then of course you have to be very careful about safety and side effects. But when it is giving recognition to a vaccination which has been already administered in a territory where the national regulatory authority has already approved it, then there is no implication for safety in your country. The vaccine has already been administered under whatever rules are there. So applying the one standard to this vaccination for travel, it should be sufficient that the National Regulatory Authority certificate of vaccination should be accepted all across the world, rather than trying to give the same degree of strictness that you would give to somebody who is taking the vaccine. So this point has not been appreciated, and I think the WHO expert group is treating everything as if they are giving clearance to administer the vaccination. Now, India reached out to South Asia and other countries for who were also hit by the pandemic and who needed the vaccines and other medical equipment and drugs. WHO also coordinated the COVAX initiative, which was a kind of multilateral way of procuring the vaccine and sending it to countries in need, funding and also that. They also coordinated the research initiatives on vaccine development. There was good sharing of research work through open sources among various people working on the vaccine and health and also COVID treatment. So what were India's strengths? India had a strong capacity in vaccine and drug production. We were already the major exporter of all kinds of vaccines to the world. We had companies who were able to producing vaccines for India as well as for export. We had the capability to scale up production of PPE and sanitation materials and equipment. Medical devices, diagnostic devices were areas where a lot of work went in, especially our national labs participated. There was a kind of sense of an Indian mission to develop these capabilities. Then we were very strong on the ICT-enabled applications. And here I must mention CoWIN, which is a unique platform which really simplified and made the vaccination process much more efficient. And I think this is the scale of CoWIN is something which could be, comparable to a global scale operation. And then telemedicine also we have good capacity. So we had certain strengths which could be used and by other countries. Now the Indian response was firstly ramping up research, especially in diagnostics, protection equipment, vaccines. As I mentioned, all our national institutions worked together on this. Stepping up production of protection materials and equipment and repurposed drugs like HCQ. Even the US asked us especially to allow HCQ, we sent it to them. A strong international cooperation from the Indian side. We sent drugs and equipment to many countries. We also received oxygen supplies when we needed it very badly in this year in April. We started building up our vaccine production, and especially 2 vaccines were approved for emergency use: Covishield, which is imported technology, and Covaxin, which is indigenous technology. So this was really our response to the whole problem. And now we have a whole landscape of vaccines which are within India undergoing various stages. 2 of them, Covaxin, Covishield, have got approval from DGCI. Sputnik has also got it. And there are a whole lot of others which have got emergency use approval and which potentially can be rolled out. That includes Pfizer, Moderna, Johnson & Johnson. So we have at least 6 vaccines which have been cleared and some of the others which are on the verge of being cleared. And we have some which are in the preclinical stage. So we have a rich spectrum of vaccine products which are under development and research and manufacturing here. And of course, the technology platforms also vary a lot. The traditional inactivated virus platform is there. Then we have the virus carrier platform, adenovirus. Then we have the recombinant particle and the mRNA platform. So all kinds of platforms are also in, and ways of administering, including at intranasal vaccine and so on. So at present, we have the 2 main largest vaccines. We have Covishield made by SIA Pune, which is technology from Oxford. It is already the largest vaccine producer in the world by doses. Then Covaxin with the technology from ICMR. The monthly production rate has gone up steadily and is expected to reach 120 and 58 million by the end of the year with government support and strong government support. Sputnik 5 is also coming up, and the capacity is about 900 million doses per year. And several other vaccines are also on the point of being rolled out, including the intranasal. So on the vaccine availability, I think we are looking better and better. Things were looking difficult in the first half of this year, but I think now we seem to have overcome this problem. And the vaccination drive, which started off on 15 January this year, that was when we actually officially launched it. There were five groups of population, starting with the most important, the health workers, frontline workers. So there are 5 groups by age also. And according to the latest data of yesterday, we have now administered a total of 1.05 billion doses, 1047 million out of which 31% are the second dose. So we still have to administer the second dose to a large number of people. Covaxin accounts for 12% of the doses. So we are 286th day of the trial. And now we are planning vaccination for children, the age group of 2 to 12 and 12 to 18 years. I think that population is approximately 520 million. 40% of our population is below 18 years. So that's going to be a huge effort again. And I think no other country has really embarked on this kind of vaccination for children. So this is going to be a big challenge ahead of us. But I'm sure that our systems are well geared up to handle this. Now, there are some other factors which come in the way. So I mentioned Sputnik 5, but Sputnik 5, the offtake has been low because, of course, price is a factor and it requires storage at -80 Celsius, which is quite tough. So pricing of vaccines is very important. And therefore, public distribution is more effective in making sure vaccines are administered. Storage requirement of some vaccines is a problem. This is with the mRNA vaccine and some of the other vaccines developed in the West. For them, this kind of thing is not a big deal. But for developing countries, this is a critical thing, that how do you make sure the vaccines are stored at the correct temperature? And that's where we have the advantage of some of our vaccines. Compliance with multiple dosing. So vaccines require 2 doses. So people should follow the 2 doses. And some vaccines now even are talking about 3 doses. The new developed malaria vaccine, which is being tried out, actually requires 4 doses. And that's being tried in Africa. So how do you make sure that people comply with this? So Covishield and Covaxin, the storage issue is less critical. And then, of course, the ramping up of testing, treatment infrastructure, control measures. And I said the challenge ahead is to expand the second dose coverage and cover children. Other challenges are how do you cope with variants? We had the Delta variant. Now we have new variant called AY4.2 reported in UK and Europe. Then the question of efficacy and dosing with different types of vaccines. So all that is still a gray area. The need for a booster dose, after how long and for what kind of people. So it's now being generally appreciated that you need a booster, say after 1 year. But who needs it most and what kind of booster, all that is issues which we'll have to deal with in 2022. So we got into this game of vaccine diplomacy. We exported vaccines to countries in need, 16% on grant basis, free, 54% on commercial basis, and via COVAX. So through COVAX, WHO, in multilateral effort, we exported 30%. So COVAX and WHO as an export channel, we did it even some time back. There was an outbreak of HIV in Sindh province of Pakistan. And they needed these antiretrovirals. And antiretrovirals were readily available next door in India. But because we didn't have a kind of direct connection, we sent our antiretrovirals were procured from India and given supply to Pakistan through WHO. So I'm sure through COVAX also some vaccines may have gone to a country like Pakistan. So totally we supplied 94 countries and the UN peacekeeping forces with 66 million doses by the end of May. We also had a special initiative vaccine supply to South Asian countries. You may have heard it called Vaccine Maitri. And South Asia, at the South Asian meetings, our Prime Minister said that we will help our South Asian neighbors in need. We had to suspend the exports in April 21 because of the outbreak in India and increased domestic uptake. And exports have now resumed. As I said, the availability situation has improved and the domestic vaccination drive has also gone quite well. So now we are in a position to export vaccines, and in the next few months, we will be able to export many more types of vaccines in larger quantities. So the vaccine diplomacy is very much now going to pick up. And this is at a time when Africa is vaccinated to the extent of only 2% of the population. So Africa is direly in need of vaccines. And there are many other countries where the vaccination rate is extremely low. They need vaccines. So I think the scope for vaccine diplomacy in the coming months is going to be quite important. Now, besides vaccine diplomacy, we have other areas where we have been working with our partners. Our Prime Minister has offered the CoWIN digital platform to other countries free of charge. He said, we'll make it available, we can customize it. And there are countries with large populations, for example, Nigeria, which are showing interest in this. As you know, this platform gives you immediately the certificate online after the vaccination, even at the first dose and second dose. And it has worked quite well, even though there are people who don't have access to this kind of digital space. There have been facilitation centers set up in villages to help the people to take advantage of this. So we have a lot of experience in this platform in various circumstances which can be used. We had online training workshops for health workers in the early days of COVID in March 2020 under our ITEC program of the External Affairs Ministry. We supplied drugs for treatment like HCQ, supply of PPE kits, PCR machines. We sent a medical team to Italy in March 2020 to test some of the stranded Indian nationals because, as you know, Italy was totally overwhelmed. They didn't have the capacity to test even their own nationals. So for the Indian nationals, we sent a medical team to help. We received also assistance from many countries during the medical oxygen crisis situation in April this year. And India and South Africa have put forward an initiative, important initiative for temporary waiver of trips for COVID-related vaccines and equipment. This has been put there, I think, almost a year now. It still has not been approved by the WTO because WTO requires agreement of all countries. And there are certain countries which don't want to clear this. But the effect of this initiative has been that this question has now got a lot of discussion internationally. A lot of international NGOs have strongly supported this, and they have put pressure on the pharmaceutical companies that they should do more to reduce the cost of vaccines and make it more accessible. This is exactly what happened during the HIV/AIDS time, when our companies were making the AIDS drugs and we are offering it at much lower prices to countries like South Africa. So we came under pressure from the multinational pharmaceutical industries. So the similar thing here, but we have a lot of support from many countries as well as the NGOs in this effort. Now, what is the present situation? COVID in evolution in India from a peak of 403,000, which was reached on 8th May, we are now down to 14,300 new cases per day, which is one important indicator. Number of deaths per day has come down from 4,500 to 805. Now, the most important indicator is new cases per day per million population. It reached a peak of 297 in May 21, and now it's down to 11.6. Now, the world average of new cases per day per million of all countries is between 40 to 65. So I think we are doing quite well on that score. Deaths per day per million population, the peak was 5.29 on 10th June. Now it's down to 0.4 to 0.58. The world average is higher, 0.57 to 1.22. So there also our indicators are looking good. Situation is not over yet. It's still very difficult. As of yesterday, the rolling 7-day average of new cases per million. So I take this as the most important indicator, the new cases per million, not the absolute numbers. If you look at the new cases per million people, that gives you the intensity of the pandemic there. And here, you see the picture is not as good as it should be because we find that all over North America and Europe and Eurasia, the northern parts, it's all in the red zone. And there are some countries which are dark red like Mongolia, Romania, Bulgaria, even some UK, where its situation does not look good at all, Denmark. So we are still in a dangerous situation where now this whole area, which is in dark red, will come under extreme winter conditions. And winter conditions are generally favorable to the re-emergence of the SARS-CoV-2 virus. People are indoors, they're more cloistered together. The virus can flourish longer times in the environment. and so on. So we are still not over. The battle is not over. I think we are going into a new phase here. So global situation is marked by high level of cases per million population in North America, Europe. The winter conditions and having partly vaccinated populations is dangerous because the virus may emerge with a new mutations which can escape vaccination. Because when you have a mix of vaccinated and partly vaccinated people and unvaccinated people, that is the most favorable circumstance for new variants. And a new variant AY4.2 of Delta has been reported spreading in UK and Europe. It is a cause of concern, contrary to what I saw today in the newspaper. They dismiss it as not being dangerous. I think it is dangerous because it has significant mutations in the spike protein structure. And the spike protein structure is the one target which is be used by many of the vaccines. So if the spike protein structure changes, then there is a high risk of vaccine evasion taking place. So we have to watch this carefully. Well, I'll stop here. Thank you. I think I've given you some idea of the situation and the challenges ahead and what all India can do. I must say, our country has done a great job in this vaccination drive. It's really a credit to India as a whole that we've achieved this kind of. In April, nobody would have thought that we could do so much. But it's really a credit to everybody in India that we've come so far. And I'm sure we'll go much further in the days ahead. So thank you, Dr. Upasana and Dr. Nishant. You can take it from here.
So thank you, Dr. Balakrishnan, for delivering such an insightful talk. We will now move on to the question and answer session. I will just ask a couple of questions before I hand over the session to Dr. Chakravarti. So very basic questions. You also mentioned in your talk that we have different types of diplomacy. We say science diplomacy, we say diplomacy for science, etc. So what's the difference between these terminologies for our audience?
Okay. And the next question?
And so what is it that takes someone to become a science diplomat?
Okay. Okay. Any others? I'll deal with this.
So I think after this, I'll hand the session over to Dr. Chakravarti and he will take it forward from here.
Okay. So types of science diplomacy, as I mentioned, this is a characterization by the Royal Society and AAAS of science in diplomacy, the one part. That means the scientists giving advice to foreign policy on what to do about things like climate change, nuclear thing, and the ozone depleting substances. These are all very technical. So diplomats per se may not be aware of the scientific background. So science in diplomacy involves the giving of scientific advice to foreign policy practitioners and diplomats about how to handle these questions in international negotiations. Apart from the political aspect, there's the technical aspect. That's science in diplomacy. Science, this is also happens in national politics. The science policy is what? Giving scientific advice to our policymakers when they are framing important actions at the national level, when they are thinking of doing something or reacting to some developments which have a scientific requirement. The scientific input is very important to our politicians. So that is one. Then there is science for diplomacy. That means you use science to bring countries together, to improve their international relations, and also to get, at the multilateral level. And then there is diplomacy for science. That means you use diplomacy for two things. One is for internal scientific capacity building, and secondly, participating in big projects, as I said, mega projects like CERN, ITER, and all on a basis of mutual benefit. It's not that we participate and we don't say what we want. Participate as an equal partner in that. Even though we may not contribute that much in money, we do contribute in brain power. So we deserve a proper place at the table in these experiments. So that that is the three aspects. And the Diaspora Connect is part of diplomacy for science subject. So that is your three types of science diplomacy. Now, how do you become a science diplomat? Well, there are many avenues. You can be a diplomat with a scientific background. That is me, like me. I started off as a theoretical physicist. And my early career, I got involved in discussions in Geneva on nuclear disarmament, chemical weapons, WHO, health issues. So I did spend a lot of my early career in areas where there was a lot of science going on. So you can be, and we have a lot of young diplomats joining our service who have a science and engineering background. We should make use of that. And gives us an advantage over many countries. This knowledge is valuable. You can use it. And also you can have people who come and work as science counselors. We have 4 posts of science counselors abroad in Berlin, in Tokyo, in Washington, and in Moscow. So these science counselors are selected from our science establishment and they are assigned for 3 years. So they have a knowledge of the scientific establishment in India and they work in a foreign country as diplomats. So that's another type of science diplomat. Many countries have different types of systems. We may have in the future more such science counselors. In fact, we should actually have something like 15, at least 15. So in the future, maybe government will create more posts of science counselors abroad. So young scientists who are working in various fields, if they're interested, they should keep an eye out for this opportunity. And whenever there is a call for applications, do apply. It is also good to have a foreign language knowledge of one foreign language. See, when I did my PhD, for example, in the US, it was required that I should pass an exam in one foreign language. So I did my qualified in French. So even as a young scientist, when you do your doctorate, there are requirements. And I think knowing a foreign language is one important thing. So you get it as a science diplomat, you have a science background, you're actively following research. If not, you're actually engaged, you're actually following what's happening in your field. And then you also get a knowledge of diplomatic practices, how you handle diplomatic challenges, how you work in a mission with a multi-dimensional team, because your other colleagues are working in different fields, maybe political, economic, but you are working in a mission which represents the country as a whole. So all that goes into the making of a science diplomat. That I think deals with those two. Now, Dr. Nishant, your turn. Please ask me the questions you have.
Yeah, thank you, Dr. Balakrishnan. So are there any training options available in India for scientists to get trained in science diplomacy? And what do you think? What is your opinion? Do we need to stress on capacity building for health diplomats?
Yeah, any other question?
There are a few more, which are more, I think, related to how.
Okay. Come to that. Yeah, definitely training in science diplomacy is important. In fact, INYAS Bangalore has been conducting training workshops for scientists from various laboratories in India. I think they conduct a 1-week training workshop in Bangalore. I did go there and deliver some lectures. So I think every year they do that. We are also looking at how we can, in RIS as part of our science diplomacy program, one of the objectives is to develop some kind of training modules for people in India. That is people working in the both universities or science laboratories. Most of our active big laboratories are in the government sector, but there are some private sector too. And then private business and industry, because they also should have some idea how to take advantage of science diplomacy, like they do for economic diplomacy. It's a must for our businessmen to know what a trade counselor does, because he may help them one day. So these are all things which certainly we should do. And there are many international courses on science diplomacy offered by some of the European organizations. And also there is a Diplo Foundation in Malta, which organizes courses. You can join up online. Of course, they charge fees for that. So there are many training opportunities across the world. TWAS does it. In fact, TWAS is very keen on working with us to have this kind of training. on science diplomacy for us. As part of our ITech program, we have been doing courses on 2-week-long courses in science diplomacy for people from other developing countries. We started in 2017, getting every year a batch of 30 or 32, but we could not do it in 21 because of the COVID. So hopefully in 22, we'll resume that. But that's mainly for our other countries. So we have not done the same kind of thing for our own people, applicants from India. So that certainly training in science diplomacy is an area which needs a lot more building up. Thank you.
Right. Okay. So what's your opinion, sir? Like, can science diplomacy help normalize geopolitics, or geopolitics may come in the way of health diplomacy?
Yeah, I think I'm an optimist there. I think science diplomacy can overcome geopolitical differences. And the clear evidence is there. We are all scientists, so we go by evidence-based analysis. So US, Soviet Union, the first contacts during the Cold War were between scientists from the US and Soviet Union. They formed scientific working groups, including on some issues connected with nuclear pollution and others. In fact, the Americans, they knew that the Soviet science is a big capacity, so they had a translation of all their Soviet journals from Russian into English. So the interaction between the scientists from the US and Soviet Union was very critical in eventually bringing, because scientists have a certain degree of influence in their respective countries. So they could bring that influence to bear and on policymakers and eventually improve the relations. Similarly, between US and Cuba, communications were totally slammed. But scientists from both sides were working together on certain issues that could work. In our case, as I mentioned, we have very bad relations with Pakistan, frankly, political. But that does not mean scientists from India and Pakistan can't work together. Common issues of common concern. If we are working together on health or diseases which are present in South Asia, it's benefits both sides. Everybody gets benefits. So who in the world could oppose this? Or if you work on things like air pollution, which is in the winter, you see we burn crops and the air in the northern part of the subcontinent is very bad. So that affects many countries. So these are areas where we could definitely do some work together. And by working together, does not mean physical movement. It means through internet, you can work together, you can exchange publications, you can have joint workshops, you can have all these activities. So build bridges using science and technology. This is certainly possible. The same could be done even with countries like China, with whom we have difficulty. So there's a lot of scope for using science as a bridge building mechanism.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you. So that brings me more close to the relevant questions to COVID-19. And like, what kind of hindrances and challenges have we faced related to science diplomacy during this COVID time? And has the foreign policy changed in India in during the last 1.5, 2 years in terms of science and science diplomacy?
Yeah, no, I think that definitely the experience of COVID has had a very significant impact on our foreign policy. Earlier, we were not so much, foreign policy was not that much involved with the health issues. Whatever happened in WHO was handled by the Ministry of Health with only occasional inputs from foreign policy. Whenever there was some political discussion in WHO about health conditions of people in Palestine or admission of Taiwan, then only foreign ministry got involved in giving political advice. Most of the substance was handled by the health ministry. But now, as a result of this, the whole foreign ministry and the health ministry are working much more closely together. And especially now that in the last year, India has been the chairman of the executive board of WHO. So this is a very important position. And of course, it's a 1-year position. But then India is also a member of the executive board. That is a 3-year term. So it's like being on the Security Council in WHO. So you actually have to play a role in whatever happens in WHO in a much more, active way. So that way, I think the past 2 years has been very important. And I think, and then of course, the foreign ministry has served as a very important bridge between various countries who wanted vaccine. There are many areas. For example, in the vaccine supply effort, our missions were addressed by the PM to go and find out what are their needs. They projected their needs to Delhi. The vaccines were dispatched. They were handed over. The whole operation was well coordinated. Similarly, when there were a lot of Indians abroad who wanted to come back to India, the foreign ministry got very actively involved because they had to be tested, they had to be quarantined, and they had to be moved. So that whole operation of in the middle of complete stopping of air travel to start these flights to bring back Indians to India and also to enable them to go back afterwards. This was an operation which involved the health ministry and the foreign ministry very closely. So this has been a lot of learning experience for both sides in our government and even the states. So I think it's been a very valuable experience. The states, the center with the health ministry as well as the foreign ministry, all working together.
Thank you, Dr. Balakrishnan. So I guess there will be several questions even after this, but in the interest of the time, I would like to first thank you once again for taking time out of your very busy schedule and agreeing to be one of our speakers. And thanks for sharing all the valuable comments on vaccine diplomacy in general, and more specifically related to overall science diplomacy. You also discussed comprehensively and summarized our vaccine efforts globally and in general about COVID-19, the initial challenges and the ongoing challenges as well. So I'm sure the audience have enjoyed a lot listening to you. The session will also be available on our INYAS's YouTube channel for those who want to see this and watch later. So with this, I would like to thank you once again, and thanks to the entire GYANTEEKA team as well. INYAS will come back with the next talk of GYANTEEKA soon. So till then, stay safe, stay healthy, and Jai Hind. Namaskar.
Thank you all of you, and all the best for your future initiatives at INYAS. You are the younger generation, and you will be taking India forward. Thank you.